Hey guys, just wanted to do a video here tonight about rebuilding the TNT shocks that we use on our TNT race cars. I've been asked, what brand are the shocks? Well, they're a TNT shock. So there's different shocks out there. They all have their similar characteristics. They're different in other ways, but we use TNT shocks on our cars. Sonic uses a dyno shock. WCM uses a shock designed by GFRP. And then on the Visions, that's a JR quarter scale shock. Again, they have differences in how they work, but in general, they're kind of all rebuilt the same way. So even if you don't have a TNT shock, hopefully this video will help you out some if you've never rebuilt a quarter scale shock before. And again, even if I'm not rebuilding the shock completely, after every couple races, I'm at least putting, getting all the old oil out of the shock and putting new oil in, because the weight rating or the viscosity of the shock oil will change over time, just like it will in your car's engine. So you want to make sure that you have maintained fresh oil in the shock, and then when you start noticing it leaking, you want to make sure that you're doing a complete and full rebuild. So that's what I'm going to do here. Hopefully this will help some guys out that have never ventured into this area, and it's definitely something that's super important. These shocks need to be well maintained, so it's another one of those items that you need to add to your list of staying after on a weekly to semi-weekly basis. So I'm going to flip the camera around here and get started. All right, so first thing we're going to do obviously is that this is the shock completely together. We're going to get the spring off of it. I'm going to get Allen wrench to make this a little bit easier. Now, some people maybe would go ahead and take the shock end or the ham end off the shock shaft. That's not something that I do at this point. You got to be careful when you're getting this ham end off the shaft that you don't gall up and scratch the shaft where it's going to go up into the O-ring and start causing issues with the O-ring. So I don't even take this ham end off anymore. I get everything, the packing and everything off from the other end, so we'll have to get the shock apart. So you got to take your set screw. That one did not have many threads going down into the shock. This is on a car that I am redoing to run trucks this year, hopefully. So we've got the set screw off of out of the top of the shock, which exposes this hole where we can start draining the oil. So all you got to do to get the oil out is just pump the piston up and down. It's easier to get the oil out at this point than it is to get the packing out and have all of the oil just run out of the bottom. So I always get as much of the oil out this way before I take the packing out. So to get the packing out of the bottom of the shock, you are going to have to, there's a snap ring here, so you're going to have to use your some snap ring pliers. And most likely the bottom of the shock is going to have some dirt kind of packed up in here. You want to get as much of that out of the way, out of there as possible. All right. We're going to use our snap ring pliers. And sometimes it can be a little bit of a pain. There we go. So, got the snap ring out of the bottom of the shock. Now we can just pull the shaft and the packing out. There we go. So if you have shock that hadn't been apart in quite some time and is an older TNT shock, it might have, the packing might be aluminum, and it's going to have two brass bushings pressed in on either end with the O-rings up inside. Most likely at this point, if that's what you're left with, everything's probably pretty badly worn out. You're going to need to contact TNT to get the new Delrin style packings. So to get the packing off of the shaft, I'm going to use a nut driver with a 5mm socket on it, and you're going to take the lock nut off to remove the piston. So the TNT shock is what I would call a clearance style shock, I guess. It's a flow around shock. So there's no holes in this piston. The oil is going to flow around the outside of the piston, between the piston and the shock body. There's the different designs of shocks. Some will have holes in the piston that the oil will flow through. There's also shocks out there that have a hole in the shaft themselves, and that's called I guess that would be a flow, another type of like flow through type shock. But what we have is a clearance type shock, or a flow around shock, so it's going to actually go around the piston. So we got the piston off. Now we can pull the packing off of the shaft. Pull the spring retainer off. We just want to wipe everything down. Now, you can use a pick. I use an X-Acto knife. Up inside the packing here is there's a orange O-ring or a silicone O-ring here. There's another silicone O-ring on the other side. Those are the O-rings that seal around the shaft. You're just going to get a hold of those. Most likely you're going to cut it. You're going to get rid of these anyway. We're replacing them. There's two schools of thought. Some people don't believe that the orange silicone O-rings are the right O-ring to have inside the packing or in the oil. Some prefer to use the black Buena rubber style O-rings. I still think that the silicone O-rings are smoother and work better because they will swell a little bit once they come in contact with silicone oil. That's not really a problem. It's only about a 20 to 30% swell rate. That helps maintain a good seal as the O-rings wear, and I think that the shocks work smoother with the silicone O-rings. So that's what I stick with, and I've even moved to starting to use the silicone O-rings around the outside of the packing as well. So the inside packing, the small O-ring is a 008 size O-ring, and the O-ring that goes around the outside of the packing is it's a 013 size O-ring. So if you can get those O-rings at different places, you can obviously get them from TNT as well. But those are the sizes. If you get them elsewhere, it's a 008 and a 013. So we need to remove the O-rings that are around the OD of the packing. There's 3 of them. All right. So we've got everything apart. What we want to do is get you don't have to like wash it and get every drop of oil out, but since we're doing a full rebuild and it's it's a lot easier to get inside the body now, I'll go ahead and run a paper towel down through there and just wipe it out really good. I don't usually like to use any kind of a solvent or anything to put down in there, because if you don't get it, unless you're going to make sure that it's good and dry, but if you have any left in there, you're just going to contaminate your oil with the solvent. So what I'm going to do now is pause for a second here and just get everything nice and cleaned up before we go back to assembly. All right, so I've got everything cleaned up and reorganized. So what we're going to do is start putting the shock packing seals in, get everything, the packing assembly back together. So the first thing that we got to do is get our small O-rings inside the packing. There's just a little groove that's in the top here and then on the other side, and we just work the small O-ring down into that groove. You don't want to use anything really sharp at this point, obviously, because you don't want to nick the O-ring. So all right, those 2 are in. Now the next thing that I've started doing, which I'm not saying is the absolute perfect case scenario, but it definitely helps cut down on some of the leaking that can go on around the outer diameter of the packing, is I use about 1.5 to 2 wraps at the most of 3/4 inch wide Teflon tape. Some of the shocks, the packing will actually screw into the bottom of the shock. Here we're just, it's not a press fit, it's a slide fit, clearance fit with the O-rings helping seal the oil from coming out of the body of the shock and around the seal pack in the body. So just a couple of wraps of the Teflon tape helps just tighten those O-rings up a little bit in the grooves. Usually when these packings are brand new and the shock body is brand new, you don't really run into any issues. But, just for the sake of making sure that we don't have, any leaking, I like to just go ahead and do this right off the bat. So usually it ends up being easier to put one O-ring in each end rather than trying to roll them back up out of the grooves and then pull the Teflon tape out, and then you can put your middle O-ring in. So we got our 3 O-rings around the outside, we got our 2 O-rings on the inside. So now we want to get our packing back on the shaft. At this point, what you don't want to do is, if you have taken your heim end off the shaft, you're going to have the threads exposed here, and trying to slide this packing across those threads is just going to tear up your O-rings. So all the work you did cleaning everything up, put new O-rings in, you just tore them, and you're going to have issues. If you don't have issues with it leaking right off the bat, it's definitely going to start leaking prematurely. Likewise, if you try to slide it over the sharp edge, even though there's a slight bevel on the piston, if you try to slide it over this sharp edge here, you're going to tear the O-rings as well. So if you just take an 1/8 inch piece of shrink wrap tubing, put it on the end of the shock here. You don't have to heat it and shrink it. You just put a unshrunk piece of new heat shrink tubing on. That will help guide the O-rings around the lip here so you won't tear the O-rings. The other thing that I do, you could use a little bit of fluid if you want, but I just use some silicone plumbing grease, Dantco, that I got from Lowe's. This is thicker than a lot of the plumbing silicone grease. So I go ahead and put some on the inner O-ring. You carefully just slide the packing onto the shaft. And everything's good. If you see it go onto the shaft across your heat shrink tubing and you don't see any little slivers of red up here at the top where you slid it on, that means that it went on, it went across that lip, and you didn't tear the O-rings, and everything feels nice and smooth. Now, we're going to put the piston back on top. I like to use a little bit of blue Loctite on the threads of the shaft here to put the nut on. So I need to clean. There's going to be some oil still left on this and some silicone grease. So I'm going to clean that off with some brake clean and then wipe it off before putting my Loctite on. Just gonna hit it with a little bit of brake clean. Wipe the brake clean off. Go ahead and put my piston back on. There's no right or wrong way to put the piston on. There's no up or down. And figured I wouldn't do this, but I did do it. I forgot to put my spring cup back on. So we'll pull our packing back off and get our spring cup on there. And go ahead and put our snap ring on. Get my heat shrink tubing back out of the packing there, and we'll put the packing back on. Now we can put our piston on. Hold the ham end on the other end here with a 5/16 wrench. You don't have to over tighten this by any means, just get it good and snug. Now we're ready to slide the whole assembly back up into our shock body. Again, put some silicone plumber's grease on our O-rings. Use a, it's not the punch I want it. Use something to help push the packing. Go ahead and get it seated all the way down against the groove inside the shock. There we go. Look around. There's really no good way of making sure that you don't possibly cut one of those O-rings as it goes in across the snap ring groove, but as long as you're only using about 1.5 to 2 turns of that Teflon tape, you shouldn't have so much pressure on the O-rings that you'll cut them, and I don't see any slivers of orange, and even if it's just a little bit, I'm not really gonna get too worried about it on those O-rings. So everything's good. We're seated, and now we can go ahead and put our snap ring back in. make sure it gets down into the groove all the way around. Just want to look at it really good and make sure it's into the groove. Everything looks good. I just wipe it off really good and make sure I get as much of that thick grease out from down around the packing. All right, so now our shock's all back together. So now we're gonna fill it with oil. I'll move over here to the vise. Makes it nice and easy way to hold the shock in place while we put the oil in it. So this is going to be a left rear shock. I tend to run my left rear shock oil thinner because we're using usually a very light spring on the left rear of the car. I just like to dampen the shock according to spring rate. The lighter the spring, go with a little bit lighter oil because that lighter spring has a hard time overcoming really thick oil. And it's all really based on kind of just what I see the car do and how it feels. You can, a general rule of thumb is 70 weight oil all the way around with a TNT shock is going to be fine. It's going to dampen the car really well, and the car is going to, work well that way. And I've been really fast with 70 all the way around. This is going to be for my truck, so I'm going to be going with 70 in all three, or 70 in the right front, 60 probably, or 70 in the left front, 60 or 70 in the right rear, and then 40 in the left rear. So we're going to go ahead and fill this one with 40 weight oil. You can get one of these syringes. You can get different size syringes from a drugstore, Walmart, in the pharmacy section. Makes it really easy to fill the shock up. You can also get, at one point I was using a cake decorating tip that would go on a cake icing, I guess. I don't even know what you call it, but if you go to Michael's, they have the aisle where you can get all the cake decorating, the icing, and that kind of stuff. I think it was a number 5 funnel, and number 5 funnel will sit down in the top of the shock, but I found that the syringe is a lot easier to work with. And you're going to fill the shock up with about 4 to 4.5 milliliters of oil. And I've switched over to using Team Losi shock oil and can't get used to taking the seal out of the top of the oil bottle. All right, so since I know that I'm usually using about 4 or 4.5 milliliters of shock fluid, I just go ahead and, looking at the marks on the syringe, I go ahead and fill it up to about the 4.5 milliliter mark. That's a give or take measurement. You might have to add some, you might end up with too much. I'm not being very patient at this point doing this video, so I'm trying to go too fast. That didn't work out like I was hoping. So I had some air trapped down in the shock there, and it was just pushing the fluid back out. So I'll have to add a little bit more. This doesn't always go perfectly. Sometimes you just have to work the shock up and down and help pull the fluid in. The other thing you can do when you're not in a hurry is just put the oil in the syringe. Don't try to push it in, just let it, just put some oil in the syringe and then leave it and just let it drain in. You'll know that you have enough oil in the shock when the shock finally feels smooth, you don't feel any air in it. But you're going to want to be looking down on the top of this shock hole here, and when you just see some oil, when you push the shock all the way, compress it all the way down, you'll just see some fluid start to fill up the little hole where the set screws into. And then you can go ahead and try to bleed it. So we got to use just a little bit more oil here. All right. Just seeing the fluid fill up into a little set screw hole, so we got plenty of fluid in it now. I just work the shock up and down a little bit. Try to make sure there's no more air in it. If there's air in it, you'll just see some air bubbles coming up, and looks like we're good. So sometimes you'll see people using these, I guess, rubber clad type washers to seal up the top of the shock. What I like to do is use Bueno rubber O-ring. Again, it's a 008 O-ring. You can get these Bueno rubber ones from Lowe's, Home Depot, hardware store. It's in the plumbing aisle. So I think these work a lot better than the ARG silicone rings, O-rings do here up on top, because these are a lot tougher. The orange just kind of just smushes out and ends up just making a mess, where these stay more intact. They're a little bit tougher. And then it's just a number 10 washer. I believe these are actually a metric washer, possibly. It's close to a number 10. They're a little bit bigger OD. I think it's actually a metric fender washer I got from hardware store. It's about the same size as the outer diameter of the shock. Seems to work really well. So we get our set screw. Put our washer on. Put our O-ring on. And I'll just get the set screw started in there, so like the first thread grabs. And then I'm looking for about 4 to 5 turns is about how deep I'll put the set screw in. There's one. That apparently, for whatever reason with this shock, is why that set screw was only in there about a turn. It won't go any further. I'm going to grab another set screw really quick. Sometimes you just never know what you're going to run into when you're working on something that is not yours. These threads have obviously been slightly galled up. All right. Now this set screw can't go in. It can go in probably about 14 or 15 total turns before you actually have the set screw down in there too far, and it'll actually contact the top of the piston. For the link set screws that come in the shocks from TNT, usually about 4 to 5 turns in and you're safe. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have not tightened this nut down just yet. When you put the set screw down in there, you got to take up some of the room of where that oil was coming up. So now you got to try to bleed off the excess oil. So you might have to back the set screw out about a half a turn to a turn and kind of rock it. Work that extra fluid out of there. So what you're looking for is the shock should feel smooth, but right now I'm getting down to the bottom of travel and I can feel a little bit of the shock gets a little tight, and that's because there's too much oil still in it. So I'll back the set screw out and a turn. Kind of wiggle the set screw, and I just heard some of the oil bleed out. See where we're at. Feels good. So you see a little bit, you'll see the shock bounce up just a little bit. That's okay. As long as it feels good and smooth all the way to the bottom of the travel. And we're still got too much oil in there. Back it out a couple more turns. Sometimes when you have it in the vise, you have it slid down in there some, you won't be getting the full stroke on the shock. So you want to pull it out and make sure you're good before you lock everything down. And I'm just kind of holding the shaft up in there with my hand. Just working that set screw a little bit, trying to get it some clearance in the threads and let some of that oil bleed out. That feels good now. Goes all the way in. Feels the same, nice and smooth. A little bit of a rebound, that's okay. Hold it up in there with my hand again. Grab a 3/8 wrench. And tighten the jam nut down. Hold the set screw with an Allen wrench and make sure we're good and tight. Again, not over tightening it, but tightening it good enough to kind of compress that O-ring on top. Feel it one more time, make sure we're good. Then you can use some brake clean. Use some brake clean here around the top to clean all that excess oil off and blow it off. And you have a rebuilt TNT shock ready to go for hopefully about a month or two before you have to do that complete rebuild again. Just keep nice, fresh, clean oil in it. Hope that helps you guys out. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Take it easy.